So welcome, good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar that is called Constructing a Narrative and Developing a Compelling Manuscript. Thank you very much, Christina, for joining us today. Let me introduce and talk a little bit about Christina. So she's my friend, but besides that, she has a PhD in English rhetoric, and she specializes in contemporary theories of composition and also on writing pedagogies and on digital literacy. Currently, Christina serves as a professor at University of Cincinnati, and she has experience conducting different workshops on scientific writing for postdoctoral researchers in biomedical sciences and graduate students like us. So welcome, Christina. Thank you very much for your presence today, and the audience is all yours.
Great, thank you. For folks who joined in the last couple minutes, I've just asked you in the chat just to take a moment to enter in what you think are some of the most important qualities in scientific writing. So yes, I am an assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati, where I specialize in both research behind the teaching of writing and also teaching writing. Teaching future writing teachers. I come from the field of rhetoric and writing, but I've also collaborated in health services research for the past 5 or 6 years now. And so I'm really excited to join you today to talk about scientific writing and how we might think about the development of our manuscripts as constructing a narrative in order to make the most compelling manuscripts possible. And so I've asked folks to think about what they think are some of the most important characteristics of scientific writing. And I see folks saying things like convey your message in a simple way, right? That's easy to understand, clear and concise, gets straight to the point, easy to read, fluidity of the writing. And I agree that these are really important characteristics in scientific writing. The quotes on this slide come from a book-length interview project with scientists from across disciplines. The researcher's name's Lisa Emerson. And I pulled these 2 quotes because I think that they capture the heart of what we're going to talk about today. So this first quote, which comes from a chemist who also does research in education and is somewhat established. They're described in the book as having an international career. This person says, I think you're always being persuasive when you are writing in science. I think you have a point of view and you're trying to get people to understand what your point of view is, no matter what, even if it's self-evident. And I really appreciate that use of the phrase, even if it's self-evident. The second quote comes from somebody described as a nationally celebrated scientist. They come from physics, and they say, you don't sit down and say the experimenter did this and then this. No, you're telling a story. And in truth, you've done all these experiments and this didn't work and that didn't work and that didn't work, but this did. And we've got to somehow sift out of all of this complexity what we've learned and throw the extraneous stuff away and tell a story. If we don't do that, no one's going to read it and it won't make an impact. It's not that we're being dishonest. And if we were, it wouldn't be accepted in any case, but we are telling a story that means something. And so I think both these quotes help to emphasize how we have to work to be persuasive, even if we think that our takeaways and the importance of our work are self-evident. We can't just expect our readers to make sense of what we found and why it's important without some help from us. And so we have to actively make sense of our research in our writing so that we can do more with our data, realize more of its nuances, and make more of an impact with our readers. So what exactly is a narrative? Because again, I'm calling for us to think about the writing of a paper as building a narrative. Technically speaking, narratives simply use words and images and other media to tell audiences about a series of connected events. In other words, to tell a story. But at their most basic level, to echo Rafael Luna, who's done a lot of writing about scientific storytelling, narratives communicate a conflict and its resolution. And I'd like to take this a step further and say that we typically also have a purpose in mind when we do this. that our purpose is to connect with readers, connect our readers with what we say, and make them think or feel or act in a particular way. Narratives help our readers to see the significance of what we're saying, connect it to the landscape of prior research and what it means for the future. And we often just think, oh, they're going to get this on their own. But actually, we have to help them to get there by building clear road signs to tell them what's new and important about our work. And so I think we can think about the building of narratives in a paper at multiple levels. So certainly we have to think about the big story that any paper sends out, its overall narrative arc that we build through the entire paper, through the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. But to support that larger story, we also have to tell stories within individual sections of the paper. So within the results, consider how you need to build bit by bit in order to communicate your biggest, most impactful finding, for example. And then we can also use storytelling as a method for understanding how we can clearly explain a central idea, even within an individual paragraph. And we're going to look at examples of building narratives at all three of these levels in the presentation today. One caveat before we move forward is that it's really important to remember that what I'm talking about are flexible principles and not black and white rules. I really firmly believe that there are very few black and white rules in writing, and that sometimes we're told black and white rules for writing because someone's trying to make it simpler for us. But truly, we have to just consider the effect of any choice that we make when we write things and how it's going to impact our audience or our readers, in other words. And writing is contextual, right? The rules of what we can and can't do, or what will be an effective choice or a less effective choice, that's always going to depend on the situation that we're in, who we're writing for, the form that we're writing, the purpose we're writing for, and many other different concerns. All right, so first let's talk about manuscript level narratives. This figure comes from Raphael Luna and also authors Gold and Vogel, and it depicts the dramatic arc of the scientific story, which the researchers note resembles kind of an energy of activation curve. First, we have the introduction that sets up the situation and characters and makes readers care about what's going to take place, care about the plot here. It frames the questions that are asked and it focuses the reader's attention. Right, the job of an introduction is almost to make the study feel inevitable. Like, well, of course we had to look at this. It's so you want to set up the scene and the stakes so much that it seems inevitable and just really important. Then the results, this forms the backbone of the manuscript, serves as the scenes of the story. And you can think about, how those individual results build. Figures and tables also help with that building, right? We arrange those logically to set up that pathway. Then we get our, clincher result, which is the climax. And then the validation, which is where we start to show that the evidence and the findings are credible within the context of other work and the state of knowledge in the field. And finally, discussion, setting up what the data means in the larger scheme of things. So we're going to use this paper as an example for the first bit of the talk. This is a paper published by the care unit at Mayo Clinic that Natalie and I have both collaborated with. This is from 2018. The paper is called Eliciting the Patient's Agenda, a secondary analysis of recorded clinical encounters. It was published in the Journal of General Internal Medicine. And here we're going to just briefly look through the abstract just to get a sense for what the paper is about, and then I'll help you map these narrative concepts onto the paper. So this paper is pretty short, sweet, and compelling, and it's rooted in a pretty clear conflict. So I think it makes for a really good example here. So the background here in this abstract says, eliciting patient concerns and listening carefully to them contributes to patient-centered care. Yet clinicians often fail to elicit the patient's agenda, and when they do, they interrupt the patient's discourse. Objective, we aim to describe the extent to which patients' concerns are elicited across different clinical settings and how shared decision-making tools impact agenda elicitation. The design and participants, they performed a secondary analysis of a random sample of 112 clinical encounters recorded during trials testing the efficacy of shared decision-making tools. The main measures. 2 reviewers working independently characterized the elicitation of the patient agenda and the time to interruption or to complete the statement. Then they analyzed the distribution of agenda elicitation according to setting and the use of shared decision-making tools. And setting was, again, they looked at either primary or specialty care and use of both use of tools and usual care. Here's their key results. Clinicians elicited the patient's agenda in 40 of 112, or 36% of encounters. Agendas were elicited more often in primary care, 49%, than in specialty care, 20%. Shared decision-making tools did not affect the likelihood of eliciting the patient's agenda, 34 versus 37% in encounters with and without the tools. And in 67% of encounters in which clinicians elicited patients' concerns, the clinician interrupted the patient after a median of 11 seconds. Uninterrupted patients took a median of 6 seconds to state their concern. So the conclusions that they reach are that clinicians seldom elicit the patient's agenda, and when they do, they interrupt patients sooner than previously reported. Physicians in specialty care elicited the patient's agenda less often compared to physicians in primary care, and failure to elicit the patient's agenda reduces the chance that clinicians will orient the priorities of a clinical encounter towards specific aspects that matter to each patient. So it's challenging in a way to look at an example of a published paper because the story that's being told kind of seems like, well, of course they told that story. But really they really had to kind of see what data would come in before they came to the central story they'd tell. And if you can see how this particular paper circulated, here are it got 146 mentions in the press. Here's a few of them. The story behind it was really compelling to people, right? That takeaway that you have 11 seconds before you get interrupted, just like, really took off. And so some of this obviously is the data, but some of this also is the way in which the story was told. And if you look at the headlines here, this framing just really helps readers to make sense of why this matters. So one way to consider how we can develop that central story is to think through each of the elements of a narrative and make sure we're communicating the full picture for our readers. So here are narrative elements we might think about when we're trying to think about what story are we going to tell. We need a protagonist, the main character, kind of like the hero here. We have antagonists, which are other characters, often opposing ones that kind of start to create conflict. A scene where everything takes place, a sense for the stakes, what's at stake here. The major conflict, which is usually your hypothesis, and then also you identify a need or an unknown and you help build momentum. And then your resolution, where you describe the methods you use, show the results you found, and explain how they meet the need identified in that conflict. So with our example of this paper, the protagonist is the patient's agenda, maybe even potentially the patient itself, but I think kind of the patient's agenda is here the protagonist. Antagonists are elicitations, but also interruptions. So again, they can be opposing or they can kind of just be other characters. Elicitations would not be opposing, but interruptions would be. The scene where this takes place is clinical encounters, both in primary and specialty care. What's at stake? And this, I think, is communicated really strongly in this paper, is patient-centered care and shared decision-making. That major conflict is how frequently is the patient's agenda elicited, and do SDM tools or specialty affect that? And then the resolution, here's their findings. Secondary analysis of 112 clinical encounter recordings revealed patients were interrupted 7 out of 10 times and every 11 seconds. Right, this just like really is compelling. It's a real story. And so again, right, the challenge is we're looking at a finished paper. It feels like, of course, they told that story, but stories are not just baked into the science. We really have to make active choices in order to build them and engage our audience. And there's a lot of ways we can do that, right? We can think about the ways we arrange the data that we really kind of emphasize with this particular paper. And that by that, I don't mean that we get selective about our findings and twist things, but rather that we think about what slice of the study we're representing here in this paper. The way we build our figures, the way we highlight the takeaways, the way we frame or contextualize the results, right? None of this is inevitable and just kind of part of it. We really have to build these things. And it's helpful to remember that the same set of data can tell many stories. So what are we going to choose to do with this paper? So one thing we might do if we want to just kind of look back at things, a strategy you might use, if you've got a draft in progress and you're asking yourself, am I telling a clear story? Is you might start by, as an exercise, isolating individual elements of the paper. Say just your figures, or maybe even your figure captions, or the first sentence of each paragraph, and ask yourself, are these elements fulfilling their purpose? Do they help the reader understand the central message? If you just pull them out, that can sometimes be really telling. You might find places where the connections aren't being built and the story is not being emphasized when you do this kind of exercise. So we've talked about building a story at the level of the entire manuscript. Now let's talk about how we might do this at the level of individual sections within a paper. So we can think about building structures kind of in this way with the paper, because in the introduction, we have to kind of start bigger and get smaller and then do the opposite with the results and discussion. So in the introduction, we need to set the scene, start more broadly than narrow in. Think about how often we start by saying, you know, here's the prevalence of the phenomenon that we are studying, or here are other ways it's been talked about before in the literature. And then we start to narrow in and help readers to see why the research question was necessary. And then with the results and discussion, we have to build things step by step so readers can follow along with us when we get to that big, you know, like clincher finding. So on the next slide, I'm going to give you a research-based view of the moves that are typically made in the introduction of a research paper. And by moves, that's a term we love to use in writing studies. I just mean the different techniques we use as writers, the strategies and choices that we take on. So the first move is, and this all comes from a linguist, John Swales. He did a genre analysis. He took a large data set, I think it was like 80 some studies of papers from different disciplines, and looked at what they do in the introduction in order to come up with this pattern. So this is not like prescriptive, like you have to do exactly this step by step, but rather this is a descriptive model that says, here is what many introductions often do, right? So there's a slight nuance to that. So the first thing that most papers do is what he calls establishing a territory, which, you know, is basically just setting up the situation. You might first talk about how important this work is. Or make big generalizations around this topic. And typically we will review items of previous research relating to your topic. Then the second move made in an introduction is what he calls establishing a niche, which here I call setting up the problem. So you might counterclaim, in other words, look at other work or findings or understandings and talk about the problems. You might indicate a gap where things have been overlooked, raise questions, or even continue a tradition, right? Replicate, or even say, here's a way of looking at things, and we've done it here, but we also need to extend it to this domain here. And then the third move is the most straightforward. That's where you do what he calls occupying the niche, or say, here's the solution. And typically that's in the form of saying, here's the purpose of this paper, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And you say, here's the research I did. Sometimes, you know, some folks even start to preview what some of the principal findings are going to be, what the structure of the paper will be. Okay, so these are the typical things we see an introduction do based on John Swales' research. So let's take this model now to map to, I looked at the introduction to this same paper. Here's what the first paragraph does. It does all this stuff from move one. It claims importance. So it says that the patient's agenda is really crucial to good communication and encounters and to good care. It reviews previous research. It looks at studies on communication and relationship skills in general practice. It further reviews previous research. It also looks at previous work done on time to interruption and how often clinicians elicit patient agendas. Then in the second paragraph, it continues some of the moves, some of these move one strategies, continues to claim importance, talks about how important patient-centered care and shared decision-making are, and also continues to review more previous research, looks at studies showing how shared decision-making tools improve care. Then in the third paragraph, the authors start to establish a niche. They start to kind of set up that problem. So they continue a tradition. They say that previous studies have looked at agendas in general care, but not specialty, right? So they're going to extend that same lens now to specialty care and do something new in that regard. They also raise a question asking if shared decision-making tools affect agenda setting and elicitation. And then finally, the third paragraph is just this objective statement that I've quoted here, where they outline the purpose of the paper. And they say, here's what the objectives of the study are. Here's what we are setting out to do. So that's one way we might think about building, how we build that story in the introduction. Here's some ways we might think about story building in the results section of a paper. And these come from a different set of researchers, but these are what they suggest for building a results section in scientific papers. First, to summarize your methods, a brief review of your research question, the general methods used, and the answers sought. That's often the way we open up a results section. And it's such a small basic move, but it can be easy to overlook sometimes in those early drafts, but it's important, right? Not only because it can help make that direct connection back to all of the problem setting and that like setup that we did in the intro, but also because we know that pragmatically, many readers will jump straight to our findings, right? And that might be the first part of the paper they look at. So we want to do this little brief kind of call back to what we had set up in the introduction. Then we start to share data, and you can think about building this in two different ways. You can either think of it as starting smaller and building outward, or as starting foundationally and building to complexity. And we want to build step by step with our logic, having each paragraph answer the previous. And figures should also support that step up in logic. And you finally want to move to your climax, the final results, and a sense for what we now know based on this study. So to look at the findings section, here I'm turning to a different example because I think sometimes basic scientists, the papers are longer and they sometimes do this in ways that are a little bit easier just to track. This is in my husband's area of research, so he kind of helped me with translating some of what this paper has to say. It's okay if you are equally as mystified as I am about what this paper says. We're just using it as an example, and I'll kind of give you some plain language translations of what's going on. So this is a paper published in Cell looking at GATA2 transcription in lung cancer. And on the left are some of the headings used in the results section. So this results section had like 11 subsections. It had like 11 headings just under results. So like I said, lengthy paper. So on the left are just like the first third of those subsections. And what I've done on the right, again, with my husband's help, is translate those into some plain language. So the first step they do is establish the idea that K-driven cancer cells need G in order to survive. Okay, so foundational concept. Then they start to build on that. So G is needed for K pathway-driven cancer cells. G is needed for cancer cell growth in live animals. Okay, so we're looking in vivo. Loss of G results in disruption of cell process P. And then finally, G regulates cell process P through gene N. So we're kind of like slowly building our understanding of these various components step by step. Even if you don't completely understand this, hopefully that is at least coming through for you, right? How it's just kind of slowly building things. So let's look at discussion sections because they also can build as well, just like results sections. And in some ways, sometimes maybe this feels less intuitive because with results, we're so close to our data, right? We've done the work to gather the data that sometimes we just know it so well when we go to write it. And the discussion is more of a mystery, like how are we going to make sense of things? So often we can begin our discussion sections by helping our readers move from results to conclusions, a brief review of what was found, and reminding them, here's how we filled that gap that we identified in the introduction. Again, a prime example of the ways in which we have to do things that might feel self-evident. We can't just rely on our readers to understand how the results we presented fill the gap. We sort of need to help them do that connective work. Then we want to build our interpretations. Again, think about starting smaller and building outward, or starting foundationally and building to complexity. What makes sense in the context of this paper? Then we talk about our limitations, and then move to the broad implications. What are the strengths of the study and how is the science better now? And again, these are things I think are easy to take for granted of someone will see the importance of this, but you have to say it explicitly. You have to do what I call answering the so what question. You want to look at your findings and say, well, so what? And then answer that question. And you want to do that in the paper. Okay, so we talked about overall manuscripts, individual sections like the introduction, results, and discussion. Now I want to talk about at the paragraph level, how we can even think about building clear ideas, building those stories. So an acronym that can help us, and things don't have to happen exactly in this order. In fact, in the examples I'll show, they don't always happen in this order, and they happen, the proportions might also vary depending on the paragraph, but nonetheless, this is a starting point for understanding building blocks. We can use the acronym MEAL, M-E-A-L, to think about main idea, evidence, analysis in the link back or lead out. So the main idea, right, that central claim the paragraph's making. Evidence is the support for that claim. So all of the examples or the data or whatever that support that main idea. The analysis, which explains or evaluates the evidence for that claim. And this doesn't necessarily need to be super interpretive. It can just be you making sense of what the paragraph said. So, you know, if you're in the results section, right, you can still use this move. And finally, that link back or lead out, conclusion of the idea and preparation for the next step. Or sometimes that can be the connection to what was said before. So let's look at some examples to see what I mean by all of this. So again, you can think about, here's a visual of how it might happen in different orders. So here is a paragraph from the results section of that same cell paper. You can see I've got color coding here to represent the link out, main idea, evidence, and analysis. So they start the first sentence of the results section with a main idea. To discover novel genes necessary in KRAS mutant cancer cells, we performed an NRA interference screen targeting some 7,000 genes in a panel. So they're reviewing their methods and what their objective was. And then here's some evidence supporting that idea. At the very end, you'll see a tiny bit of what we're calling analysis. And I know that sounds interpretive. Scientists get scared about that, I understand, but see how it's really just trying to make sense of all of that data for the reader. Taken together, these findings suggest that KRAS mutant NSCLC cells depend upon GATA2 for survival. Here is the next paragraph. It starts with a link out. It starts by referring to the above findings, reminding us what they show, and then moving into, in the same sentence, what the next concept is going to be. So although we found this other thing was unclear. Here's the evidence related to that. So they found that certain cells exhibited reduced viability with loss of either KRAS or GATA2. Here's some other findings, and then analysis. In sum, these findings suggest that GATA2 is broadly required in the survival of RAS pathway mutant NSCLC. Here, this paragraph really is just a main idea and evidence, and a second paragraph is really just evidence. So again, we're seeing some variability depending on where we are in the paper. That's okay, right? Again, these are not black and white rules. These are models that we can kind of play with as necessary. Here, we're getting more towards the end, so we're seeing a little bit more sense stock taking, right? These results indicate, here's something else we looked at, taken together, these results show. So oh, and here's one more. I even had one more example, right? Although the above study showed this, we also examined this main idea. Here's the evidence supporting it. Collectively, these results indicate blah, 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 blah. All right. So again, lots of making sense of things for your readers. I also think that this technique is super important actually sometimes in your introduction. If you have something with a lengthy introduction where you're reviewing lots of previous studies and literature, you kind of need to take a step back after doing summary to tell your readers what on earth this all means when taken together and do that synthesis work. So some takeaways from all of this and also some strategies that I suggest for putting some of these principles into action. So again, stories need to be built. We can't just assume our audience will automatically discern them. And it's helpful to remember that everything in a paper serves a purpose and has an effect on our audience. And so every time we're doing anything, we can help support those stories and make sure that idea is coming through. So work towards essential narrative and understand that process is going to take time and revision and reworking things, and build that message through each section and support it within those sections of the paper. So for building step by step, it's helpful again to remember that writing happens slowly and in stages. Think about starting with a guiding question because that can help that central message to emerge. I sometimes like try building an outline and starting with like some topic sentences and then filling in the rest from there. That sometimes can help with this. But you also can start drafting and then look back and rework things too, if that works better for your process. So maybe you've got a draft that's starting to come together and you want to take a look at it and assess how it's building up. So you might ask yourself if the results in discussion fill the gap you identified in the introduction, and also if you're making it clear how. Ask yourself if your title still reflects where you're taking the paper. Take a look at each paragraph. Ask yourself, are each of these unified around one central idea? You might try reverse outlining as a diagnostic. And by reverse outlining, I mean this technique, and this is one of my favorites, for kind of getting that bird's eye view and stepping back from a paper, getting a little distance. In the left margin, write a little summary for yourself of what each paragraph is saying, like just a tweet of the content, if you will. And then on the right, a sentence that describes the function that it's performing, right? Here I am presenting result 1. Here I am, doing what move you're making. Here I am reviewing previous studies in my introduction. Here I am identifying how the study fills the gap in the discussion. And again, you might also, another way to kind of get that distance and evaluate things is maybe to isolate different elements of the paper and ask if they help tell the story or if they need to be revised in order to do that, right? Look at the first sentence of each paragraph. Look at each figure on its own. Look at your figure captions on their own. Look at your title. So I would love to talk through questions you have, other examples that you want to think through. Thanks to a few folks who've helped with this. Figure designs, I had a lot of help from Kevin Shaw. Had a lot of feedback from various folks putting these slides together. And again, I'm happy to share them. There's a bunch of resources at the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina. It was a very nice presentation. It was very nice to listen to your recommendations. And I would like to invite our participants to open their cameras and maybe raise their hands to make some questions.
The chat works too. If that's easier for folks, you can also write in the chat.
Well, I'm going to break the ice. I have a question. I would like to know, like, following all these recommendations, when will be like the moment to say, okay, this is good or this is ready? Is this like a personal moment, or can I like recur to other people maybe to help me to see the quality of the work that where am I in a certain moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a judgment call because we can always improve everything, everything we're writing. It kind of gets to a point where you say this seems good enough to send out, right? And in fact, sometimes the advice I give to writers is not to hold on to things too long, to get things good enough to send out for review, because reviewers will always have suggestions. So we don't want to hold on to things too long sometimes. But that's where I think that colleagues, co-authors, mentors are helpful, because I think we need that distance sometimes to really assess if something's ready. And with more practice, maybe we get a better intuitive sense for it. But I just think it always helps to get feedback from other people to judge whether something's ready, whether that story's coming through, whether things are clear enough that it's time now for it to go out for review. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yes, it does. Thank you, Christina. We have
Yeah.
a question on the chat, and it says, what are your best tricks to figure out what is the best story to tell from the data set that we have?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you might just start by thinking about that so what question related to your central hypothesis. Like posing your central hypothesis, asking yourself how you would answer that in an elevator pitch, and then further saying kind of so what might lead you towards kind of that one best story. And it might also be that there's not one single best story. It might be, in fact, if it's a large enough project, it might be that you're going to put out multiple papers, and you have to even think about those as building blocks so that you can build on the first one with the second, that sort of thing, right? Like I'm thinking about first, if you had like a mixed methods study, for instance, right? Like that first study might kind of be the quantitative piece of here's what is happening and how frequently. And then that second piece might be the qualitative piece that's here's the nature of that concept phenomenon that's happening we established in that first paper. So it kind of depends, right? You might have like something that's more contained. It's really going to be just one paper based on your data. But I think that can help, is just to think about if you were to tell somebody why this work matters. And sometimes it's really helpful to imagine like an outside of your field audience, what is the most compelling thing you can tell them about why it matters?
Thank you very much, Christina.
Yeah.
Another question that I see here is, what is the number one key message to remember for someone writing their first article ever?
Yeah, I think to write in stages and to use examples, because the examples can often help answer your questions. If you're like, how should I structure my introduction, right? The strategies I presented for structuring the introduction come from looking at examples, right? It's just that he looked at like 80 examples. Now you're probably going to look at, I like to gather at least 2 or 3 papers when I'm trying to say, well, how should I do this thing? How do other people do it? Is usually the way I try to answer that. And when you look at least 2 or 3, then you get a sense for a pattern rather than, well, here's how this one person did it. So I think the key thing to remember is, so I think that's a key thing is to write in stages and know that you'll have to keep going back to things and revising them. And the second is to look at examples, look at lots of examples to answer your questions about how to do things. And that's another good question I see in the chat for overcoming the fear to share work in progress. You kind of just got to do it. It's exposure therapy in a way. And it's never going to feel fully comfortable. You just kind of get more practiced at it. There's always going to be times when you feel a little nervous about it. But I think it helps to start with people and kind of just feel comfortable with on an interpersonal level, and showing them, build a writing group with friends, because even among your peers, it's just helpful you know, like even if someone isn't a super established scientist, they can tell you as a reader what their experience is reading the draft. Like here, I'm a little confused. What are we talking about? Or here you kind of seem to jump around a little bit. Like they can always describe their experience of reading it. And that's your best teacher. The thing that every writer needs is an audience, and an audience is your very best teacher. So how are they experiencing the draft, and how does that indicate how to change it from there? But it's for sure, I'm glad it got brought up, like the fear of sharing work in progress. It's always going to feel a little nerve-wracking. That's a very valid feeling about all of this. And then I also see, do these recommendations work for a thesis or for writing scientific articles? So we were talking most directly about writing articles, writing papers, but you can transfer some of these principles to writing a thesis. It's just that it's going to look differently. So, you know, for instance, you might have more room in the introduction than you might do in a paper, but you're still going to do the same sorts of moves. You're still going to, you know, talk about how important this area of research is and why. You're still going to point to previous research. You're still going to do all of these, many of these same moves, just maybe at a different scale and in a different way. You know, these are, I think, somewhat flexible principles. It's just that there might be other limitations in place when you're working in these different forms. Yeah,
Thank you very much, Christina. And we have Imola here that would like to make a question. Thank you.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for the talk. I have more a question about the very first paragraph when you're about to setting the scene and arrive to your niche.
Mm-hmm.
I often have the tendency to report previous results in a very bored way. And I was wondering, like, if there's a golden standard to know, like, how many references should I cite to not to get lost and talk about everything without losing the focus, you know?
Yeah, such a common problem. So there's no one like black and white rule for here's how, but I think the key is exactly what you said, where if the reader starts to feel a loss of focus, so use your peers, use your mentors, use your co-authors. And if they read your paragraph and say, I start to lose the main idea, then you know you need to pull back. And I think often what happens in early stages, and sometimes when we're also earlier in our careers and less practiced at writing, is sometimes we're trying so hard to make sure the readers understand our references to the previous research. And we also want to be so dutiful and show that we've read it carefully, that we write these really careful, long summaries. And sometimes really what you need is just a single paragraph that establishes an idea and with several citations from several studies. So often the key is to pull back, because we want to find that balance between, it's not just all about what the other studies say, but also what sense we make of them. And so something like that MEAL acronym can help. What if you took different colored highlighters, for instance, and you highlighted each sentence of your paragraph to see, wow, it's all green. There's no blue here. So the reader's going to be really lost. That might help you understand where your proportions are. And then you might see for yourself, oh, I really need to step back and give less detail here with the summaries to the previous literature.
Okay,
but yeah,
thank you.
Common challenge. I'm glad you asked about that.
Christina, and that makes me think, and I don't know if you ever tell me this, but is there like a good proportion of colors now that you mention the last example, like there was too much blue or no blue, or is there like a good proportion in a paragraph, like for us to take in consideration?
It depends, right? So, which is always what I tell my students when they ask me questions about writing, it depends. So first of all, it might depend on what section of the manuscript you're in. It depends on what part of that section you're in, because at the beginning and the end of that section, you might have less evidence, the green, and more like of the yellow central ideas or the blue like analysis. So it will vary. Nonetheless, probably you want to make sure that you have kind of probably the one you want to have the least of is probably the pink, the links, but you want there to be some links to help your readers. Then and then maybe you want a little bit, but not too much of the yellow and the blue, the main ideas and the kind of takeaways analysis. And then probably in most parts, you want the most of it to be green. But again, I think sometimes the tendency, what we were just saying with the introduction, right, is to review so much previous literature, green, 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 green. Here's all the evidence, that the main idea gets lost. What we're talking about gets lost. You want to have a clear sense for the pathway, you want to build momentum in a cleared way. So that's where that pink and yellow and blue all come together to help you keep pushing the reader forward and understanding where we are headed next.
Okay.
Yeah.
I feel I'm making a lot of questions, but I have one more. Is there like a difference in the language we're going to use when we're writing qualitative versus quantitative methods?
I mean, in the results section, probably, because the data are more interpretive with qualitative work. And so it's a little bit harder to not do any interpretation in the results section because realistically, all of the data are interpretive to some degree. But I think sometimes the writing kind of gets a little choppy sometimes with quantitative, but I don't know that that has to be that way. I just think sometimes there's less attention to these things, but I think it could be improved if they did more of this. So my sense is no, it shouldn't be that way, but maybe it just kind of is. So I don't know that I have a good answer to this. And I think it can also depend disciplinarily. Again, like the basic science paper that I used as an example did more of the analysis and linking and all those sorts of things probably than like many shorter papers from healthcare medicine, let's say.
So Ariane have a question, she's asking how many characters should be introduced not to lose the readers. Like she noted that sometimes there is a tendency of new writers to introduce too many characters.
Yeah, I think that's a really great observation. And I think that's exactly why it's helpful to think about what is the story you're telling with this paper, because I think sometimes people try to, especially earlier in our career, we did a study, okay, and then we want to write about everything we found from the study in the one paper. And that's where you kind of see it emerging as they're putting too many characters in. And so you have to step back and say, actually, here's the one story we're going to tell first. And then we can always write another paper about it and say this other aspect and introduce these other, characters here. So again, I don't have like a black and white exactly this many, but I think that your sense for where does this get, what's helpful for keeping this focused, and where does it start to feel too big, or where could it start to break into two parts or three parts even, is going to be helpful. And that's always where other readers, co-authors, folks like mentors are helpful for figuring out what needs to be the one paper here, and what could we kind of save for another part of the story.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking.
So thank you, Christina, for answering to all of our questions.
Yeah,
Is
you're
there
welcome.
any other question that you would like to ask Christina? So I don't see anyone raising their hands, and I don't really have any other questions, Christina. So
Great.
I would really like to thank you again for making time to share with us. And we really appreciate you sharing all your expertise in this subject. And
Mhm.
well, thank you.
Thank you for
So,
having me.
yeah, and thank you everybody for your attendance. And we will see you later in another occasion. So have a good afternoon and we'll see you later.